Part 3. Attila turns west. Page 74. Chapter 9. Honoria's honor. Attila gets a strange plea for help and uses it as an excuse to make war. In 450, Attila's enemy, Emperor Theodosius II, died. But in the Hun capital, the news hardly called for celebration. For years, Attila had been able to extort higher and higher payments from Theodosius. The new emperor, Marcian, would not be such a pushover. He abruptly cut off the flow of gold to the Huns. When Attila sent envoys to threaten him, the emperor replied that he reserved gold for his friends. To his enemies, he gave the iron in his sword. Marcian's hard line forced Attila into a tough choice. Try again to sack Constantinople or find another supply of loot. Rather than batter his army against the massive walls of the eastern capital, Attila looked to the west. In the past decades, the Huns' old Roman friend, Aetius, had worked hard to keep the West Roman Empire from falling apart. But by 450, the Romans had become just one more tribe jockeying for power with their neighbors. In North Africa, the Vandals had taken over Rome's wealthiest province. In Europe, the Visigoths, the Alans, the Sueves, and other peoples had sieged huge chunks of Roman land. The West Roman Empire had never been weaker. Attila recognized the opportunity and set his sights on Gaul. Since 425, Aetius had been trying to maintain Roman control over the region, but it was no easy task. A tribe in the northeast, the Franks, stubbornly guarded their independence. In the southwest, the Visigoths had their own kingdom. With bands of thieves running wild in between, Gaul was ripe for invasion. All Attila needed was an excuse to attack. In 450, the excuse arrived in the form of a letter from the sister of Valentinian III, the West Roman Emperor. Her name was Honoria, and she wanted Attila's help. Honoria had been discovered plotting against her brother with a lover. Most likely she had planned to marry the man, murder her brother, and seize the throne. But Valentinian's advisors discovered the plot and had her lover executed. Then they forced Honoria into engagement with a man she despised. Enraged, Honoria sent her message to Attila. With it, she included money and a gold ring. It's not clear what Honoria intended, but Attila decided to interpret her gesture as a marriage proposal. He sent off a message to Valentinian, demanding that he, Attila, be allowed to marry Honoria. The two of them, he added, must be given control over half the empire. Valentinian most likely thought that Attila had gone mad. He informed the Hun king that Honoria was engaged to someone else and that women had no right to power. Attila supposedly sent an ambassador back to Ravenna with a simple message. Attila has ordered you, through me, to prepare your palace for him. Page 78. Chapter 10, Invasion of Gaul. Attila strikes terror in Western Europe. In early 451, Attila's war machine began to rumble toward Gaul and the kingdom of the Visigoths. At least 250,000 men marched across what is now Germany. They moved northwest along the Danube to the Rhine River, which had served as the border between the Hun kingdom and Gaul. The Huns carried little food or water. They lived off the land, looting towns and villages as they went. The massive army moved slowly. Wagons and horses had to be ferried across rivers swollen by spring rains. At each crossing, Attila's troops stopped to cut logs and build rafts. The Huns managed only about 13 miles a day. Their slow pace gave most villagers time to escape with whatever valuables they could carry. Attila wanted to reach the heart of Gaul before Aetius could organize resistance. To keep his army moving, Attila simply bypassed most fortified cities. The Huns did manage to capture the city of Metz after a short flight. According to Roman reports, the inhabitants were slaughtered. Many died in the flames that destroyed the city. The Huns continued their march through Gaul, leaving a trail of violence that has given rise to countless folk tales about Attila's cruelty. In the city of Reims, most people fled before the Huns arrived. The local bishop, Nicasius, supposedly stayed and held a special church service. He was singing a hymn when a Hun soldier cut off his head. According to legend, the bishop's head continued to sing after it was severed from his body. The Roman Catholic Church later declared Nicasius a saint. Another story involves a devoutly religious woman named Ursula who had a large following of Christian worshippers. She was said to be a great beauty who had refused to marry in order to devote herself to God. Attila himself supposedly saw Ursula and asked that she become his wife. She refused, so he killed Ursula and thousands of women who were her followers. Like Nicasius, she was declared a saint by the Catholic Church. Attila moved on to Troyes, where he acquired the nickname Scourge of God during his encounter with the bishop Lupus. The Scourge of God, however, was about to suffer his own punishment at the hands of an old ally. Page 82. Chapter 11, The Rescue of Orleans. The Roman cavalry stops Attila in the nick of time. Attila invaded Gaul, expecting the resistance to be divided and weak. The two strongest powers in the region, the Romans and the Visigoths, had fought over control of Gaul for decades. Tensions between the two enemies were always high. Aetius, however, had realized that he needed help from the Visigoths. His army was too small to survive against Attila's massive force. So he swallowed his pride and sent ambassadors to form an alliance with Theodoric, king of the Visigoths. Aetius's ambassadors told Theodoric that Attila was the enemy of all nature. The Hun king not only threatened both the Romans and the Visigoths, he wanted to enslave the whole world. To stop him, the Romans and the Visigoths had to bury their disagreements and join forces against the Huns. Theodoric supposedly announced his reply in front of his generals. "Romans," he said, "you shall have what you desire. You have made Attila our foe as well." Aetius led his Roman army to meet the Visigoths, and the combined force raced north to stop Attila. The Huns, meanwhile, arrived at the gates of Orleans, one of the biggest cities in Gaul. Attila's men surrounded the city. They hammered at the city walls with battering rams and catapults. The Romans of Orleans were terrified. The deadly thud, thud, thud of the Hun battering rams echoed throughout the city. Panic-stricken people flung themselves to the ground in prayer. Attila ignored an offer of surrender from the city's leaders and sent his men storming through the shattered walls. The looting began almost immediately. Yet even as the Huns poured in, a watchman yelled to everyone who could hear. The Roman cavalry were approaching in the distance. "It is the aid of the god," cried the city's bishop. Attila quickly realized that his enemies had united against him. With a combined force of Romans and Visigoths bearing down on him, he could not defend the city whose walls he had just smashed. Nor were the woods around Orleans a good place to deploy his men. He needed a flat area where his archers could maneuver on horseback. The Hun king pulled his men out of Orleans before the Romans could cut off his escape. But with Aetius in pursuit, a major battle would be hard to avoid. Attila consulted his fortune tellers and priests. They read the fortune by examining the blood and the guts of a slaughtered cow. The fortune tellers hesitated and then told their king what they had seen. Fighting a battle now would mean a terrible defeat for the Huns, but an enemy commander would die in the battle. To Attila, it seemed like a risk worth taking. Aetius, he reasoned, must be the doomed commander. Without Aetius's skilled leadership, the West Roman Empire would crumble. It would be worth a defeat on the battlefield to get the great Roman commander out of the way. The Huns would retreat and then return in forces to bring the weakened empire to its knees. The king of the Huns decided to fight. He chose a battlefield near the town of Chalons called the Catalonian Fields. It was a wide open plain dominated by a small hill. All of it would soon be drenched in blood. Page 89, Chapter 12, A Battle for the Ages. Attila pays a high price at the Catalonian Fields. In the middle of June 451, on an open plain in the center of Gaul, close to 500,000 men squared off for control of ancient Europe. On one side stood Aetius's forces, Romans, Visigoths, and Alans, dressed in armor made of leather or bronze scales. Thousands more sat astride armored horses, ready to charge on a signal from their captain. Across the plain, Attila's men gathered on the banks of the Marne River. Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, Swabians, and Thuringians filled the ranks of Attila's infantry. Deadly Hun archers rode horseback, each with a quiver of 60 arrows at the ready. Despite the diversity in Attila's army, there was no doubt who was in charge. The leaders of the various nations hung upon Attila's nod like slaves, wrote a Visigoth historian named Jordanes. And when he gave a sign, even by a glance, without a murmur, each stood forth in fear and trembling. As the battle began, the two sides raced to control the hill rising from the plain. The Visigoths arrived first and took control of the summit. They swept down on the Huns, driving them back into their own lines. Attila regrouped and prepared to lead his men headlong into the center of the enemy. According to Jordanes, the Hun king rallied his soldiers with a speech. "Now show your cunning, Huns. Now show your deeds of arms," he said. "Let the wounded exact in return the death of his foe. Let the unwounded revel in slaughter of the enemy. Why would fortune have made the Huns victorious over so many nations unless it were to prepare them for the joy of this conflict?" With the clank of swords and the thunder of footsteps, the Huns unleashed a ferocious attack. A force of Ostrogoths stormed the hill. Foot soldiers advanced across the plain. The Hun cavalry led the charge, darting toward Aetius's main force. Mounted Hun archers raced in, launched a volley of arrows, and then retreated to let the next wave take their place. The sky filled with the deadly whistle of arrows. Most of them hit shields or armor or missed altogether, but the clouds of missiles found plenty of targets. Romans and Visigoths crumbled to the ground, wounded or dead. The Romans and the Visigoths pressed forward through the hail of arrows. They fought their way into the lines of Hun foot soldiers, and the clang of iron swords rang out above the battle. The fighting grew. Fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting, according to the Jordanes. Slowly, the Romans and Visigoths pushed the Hun army back. Attila and his bodyguards retreated to a circle of wagons in the rear of the Hun lines. Arrows from the Roman archers began to fall around them. Aetius knew that he had the Huns confused and nearly surrounded. Perhaps one more push would wipe out the dreaded Attila. But the Visigoths suddenly turned away from the fighting. King Theodoric was missing. They searched the battlefield frantically for some time, easing the pressure on the Huns. Finally, the Visigoths uncovered their leader's body amidst a pile of corpses. "They found him where the dead lay thickest, as happens with brave men," wrote Jordanes. "They honored him with songs and bore him away in the sight of the enemy. You might have seen the band of Visigoths shouting with dissonant cries and paying the honors of death while the battle still raged." The Roman attack continued even while the Visigoths mourned their king. Shaken by the onslaught, Attila panicked. He ordered his men to build a funeral pyre for him. Attila knew what happened to barbarian leaders who fell into Roman hands. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar had captured a barbarian king in Gaul. Caesar paraded his captive through the streets of Rome in chains and later had him strangled. Attila would rather go up in flames than suffer that fate. But his aides convinced him that the battle was not yet lost. The Huns might still salvage a small victory from his terrible defeat. Chapter 13, page 95. Fight another day. Aetius gives Attila an unexpected reprieve. Around 9 p.m., the sun finally set on the Catalonian fields. The gathering dark made it impossible to tell friend from foe. The clatter of swords and the bellowing of men in combat died away. Groans and screams from the wounded filled the survivors' ears. Dying men called out for their mothers or wives. Injured horses whinnied in pain. Sweating, exhausted men stumbled back to their own side of the battlefield and tried to find something to eat or drink. A small stream ran through the battlefield, colored red with blood. Jordanes writes that those whose wounds drove them to slake their parching thirst drank water mingled with gore. Attila gathered his surviving soldiers behind the circle of wagons, the river at their backs. The Romans had cornered the Hun king, but they had not defeated him. In fact, according to Jordanes, Attila terrified the Romans even in his weakened state. He was like a lion pierced by hunting spears, who paces to and fro from the mouth of his den, and dares not spring, but ceases not to terrify the neighborhood by his roaring. Attila wondered what the morning would bring. Would Aetius launch an all-out assault on the Huns? Or would he wait and wear Attila's army down with the siege? Either way, Attila couldn't hold out for long. As it turned out, Aetius was planning to wait until his Romans had starved out the Hun camp. But the Visigoths had other ideas. Distracted by the loss of their king, they decided to desert the battlefield. It may be that the Theodoric's death set off a power struggle among his sons, or perhaps the new ruler did not approve of fighting alongside Romans. It's also possible that Aetius never intended to destroy Attila. The Huns had been allies for a long time, and they might still be useful in future disputes with the Visigoths. Wiping them out could weaken the Romans' already shaky grip on Western Europe. Attila watched in astonishment as the Romans withdrew. At first he suspected a trap. Gradually it became clear that he and his enemy were free to go. His weary soldiers picked themselves up and saddled their horses. They loaded the wounded in wagons and headed east for home. Nobody is sure how many dead were left behind. Between 15,000 and 30,000 men had probably been killed on the Catalonian fields. Had Attila won his showdown with Aetius, the victory might have changed the course of history. The Huns could have extended their empire throughout Western Europe. Christian churches might have disappeared in France, Italy, Spain, and Germany, replaced by the pagan rituals of the Huns. Instead, the Huns retreated eastward to regroup. Attila's fortune-tellers had been right about the Catalonian fields. A great commander, King Theodoric, did die on the battlefield. But the fortune-tellers failed to predict other, more important consequences of the battle. They failed to see that the Catalonian fields would be the West Roman Empire's last great military victory. Rome's 800 years of dominance were finally coming to an end. The fortune-tellers also failed to see the most important outcomes for Attila. The Hun king had reached the peak of his power. He was still a terror, still a mighty warlord with huge armies at his command. He would rise again, destroy cities, and crush enemies. But the defeat at the Catalonian fields spelled the beginning of the end for Attila's empire. Part 4. Final Battles. Page 102. Chapter 14. The Birds of Aquileia. Attila's superstition dooms a city. Attila had been trained from birth for battle. As he rose to power, fighting became a political necessity. To control his people, Attila needed loot to pay soldiers and conquests to supply him with new recruits. The king of the Huns needed war. In the spring of 452, he created one. This time he took a smaller army on the march, probably around 100,000 men. A small force would move quickly and be fairly easy to feed. Attila also chose a new target. He saw that attacking Gaul again would reunite the Romans and Visigoths against him. But if Attila invaded the Roman heartland, the Visigoths would stand aside and let the Romans fight alone. Attila set his sights on the city of Rome. Valentinian III, the West Roman emperor, lived in Ravenna near Italy's eastern coast, but Rome was still the heart of the empire. Seizing the city, or even placing it in danger, would restore Attila's reputation as a warrior. As an added incentive, the 700-mile route to Rome presented plenty of wealthy cities for the Huns to plunder. As Attila's men raced south and west into Italy, they reached the first prize of their campaign, a port city on the Adriatic Sea called Aquileia. Traders brought their goods to Aquileia from all over the empire. Jewish glassmakers in the city made some of the world's finest glassware. Aquileia boasted so much wealth and culture that people called it a second Rome. With riches to protect, the Aquilians made sure their city was well defended. High, thick walls and the waters of the Netosoni River protected the city from attack. Despite these obstacles, Attila decided he could not pass up such a rich prize. From June through July, his army tried to batter its way into Aquileia. The Huns swung huge battering rams against the gates. They used gigantic slings to hurl boulders at the walls, but the city's defenses held. After weeks of frustration, Attila's men began to grumble. The soldiers wanted action, not a long siege. They also wanted loot, and time was running out. Armies seldom fought during the Cold War winter months. One day in late summer, Attila was ready to call off the siege, but before he ordered his army to withdraw, he took one last walk around Aquileia's walls. He noticed some storks flying from the city with their young. Fortune-tellers of the time closely followed the movement of birds. Roman armies even carried special chickens with them. If the chickens dropped some of their food while eating, soldiers believed that their next battle would go well. Attila's fortune-tellers saw the departing storks as a sign from heaven. According to Jordanes, Attila told his men, "Look at the birds, which foresee what is to come, leaving the doomed city, deserting endangered strongholds which are about to fall. Do not think this is without meaning. It is certain. They know what is going to happen. Fear of the future changes their habits." Attila's confidence breathed new life into the siege. His men redoubled their efforts with the battering rams and the slings. Before long, the Huns proved Attila's prediction right. Aquileia's walls began to crumble. Attila's men poured into the city. Giordani says that they despoiled, smashed asunder, and devastated so savagely that they hardly left a trace of the city to be seen. Aquileia never regained its importance. Today, it is little more than a small town. Page 106, Birth of Venice. Attila's march through Italy in 452 left thousands of people homeless. Thousands of villagers hid their belongings and fled before the greed and bloodlust of the Huns. According to tradition, refugees from Aquileia, Padua, and other nearby cities sought safety in a marsh known as Laguna Veneta. It was a soggy refuge crisscrossed by water channels, and Attila's horsemen found it impossible to give chase. Later, invaders such as the Lombards forced still more refugees into the area. Over time, these refugees began building a great port on the Adriatic Sea. Today, it's known as the city of Venice. Page 108, Chapter 15, Attila and the Pope. The Huns once again stop short and go home. Late in the summer of 452, Attila's army continued its relentless march across northern Italy, carving a path from Aquileia to Milan. Other cities tried to avoid Aquileia's fate. They threw open their gates to the Huns, hoping for mercy. Attila's men still burned and looted, but in most cases the inhabitants had time to flee. Attila rolled brutally through the cities of Padua, Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, and Bergamo. In Milan, Italy, Attila decided to set up a camp for a while. For more than 100 years, until 402, the city had served as the capital of the West Roman Empire. Attila made his home in a palace once inhabited by generations of Roman emperors. One of the paintings in the palace caught his attention. It showed two Roman emperors looking down on a barbarian king who groveled at their feet. Attila decided the painting needed revision, and he called in a local painter to do the job. In the new version, the two emperors could be seen piling gold at Attila's feet. From Milan, Attila considered his next move. With the West Roman Empire no longer commanding the loyalty of its people, Aetius had failed to pull together an army large enough to oppose the Huns. The road to Rome lay open to Attila, yet the Hun king decided not to take it. Once again, fortune-tellers played a role in the fate of the empire. They told Attila that taking Rome would mean disaster for the Huns. Attila, they said, would meet the same fate as the last barbarian king to sack Rome. Alaric, the Visigoth king who overran the city in 410, died shortly after his great victory. With this prediction in mind, Attila welcomed a group of envoys from the Roman emperor. Among them was Pope Leo I, head of the Catholic Church. Leo was a zealous leader, determined to advance the faith at all costs. He had burned anti-Christian books and ruthlessly persecuted anyone who did not hold Christian beliefs. Many Christian accounts portray Leo as a hero in his meeting with Attila. They suggest that Leo's strength and piety tamed the wild Hun king. As one writer put it, Attila was so flattered by the presence of the highest priest Leo that he ordered his men to stop the hostilities and, promising peace, returned beyond the Danube. In reality, Leo probably handled Attila in a time-tested way. He bribed the Hun king to go home. Attila accepted the bribe because staying in Italy had proved to be harder than expected. Once again, disease had ripped through the ranks of his army. Supplies were running short, and Attila's own fortune-tellers had predicted doom if he pressed on to Rome. Attila weighed his options, and in the autumn of 452, he ordered his men back to Pannonia. As it would turn out, however, no retreat could keep bad fortune from closing in on the king of the Huns. Page 113. Chapter 16, A Wedding and a Funeral. Attila and his new wife have a dreadful wedding night. In the spring of 453, Attila had reached his mid-50s. He was apparently in good health, and he still had dreams of conquest. There were plenty of targets for Attila to choose from. The East Roman Emperor Marcian had already provoked Attila by refusing to send his annual payment of gold. Attila threatened to send an army charging down the Danube River to lay waste to Constantinople. The West Romans still presented an easy target. Perhaps Attila meant to return to Italy and finish off Rome once and for all, or perhaps he intended to play the schoolyard bully, extorting money from the West Romans by keeping them in fear. Attila might have had other conquests in mind as well. Looking east, he would have seen the large and vulnerable Persian Empire in the Middle East. The Persians could have provided a rich new source of gold and slaves. By yet another account, Attila was already punishing barbarian tribes that had sided with the Romans. He threatened the Visigoths in the west, but then attacked the Alans to the east. As he was shrewd and crafty, he threatened in one direction and moved his army in another, Jordanes wrote. In the midst of his war plans, Attila married once again in the spring of 453. He had been sent a beautiful German girl named Ildiko as another bride. Lesser rulers often gave women to Hun kings as presents, much as they would give animal skins or jewelry. Attila was not known for excessive revelry, but the Huns celebrated special occasions by giving many toasts. After each toast, the people present had to drink all the wine or beer in their glasses. Failure to do so was considered rude. After feasting and drinking all night, Attila and Ildiko went to bed. The next morning, the king of the Huns appeared to sleep late. That was no surprise. But hours had passed, and he still did not appear. Aides knocked anxiously at the door, but heard only sobbing on the other side. Frightened, they finally kicked in the door. What they found shocked everyone. Attila, king of the Huns, lay on his bed in a pool of blood. At first, it looked like he had been murdered, but there was no signs of violence. It soon became clear that Attila had coughed up blood in his sleep. The hemorrhage may have been caused by a burst artery or vein. Perhaps an ulcer was to blame. Whatever the cause, Attila choked on his own blood and died. Ildiko went to bed with the king of the Huns and woke up beside a corpse. Apparently, she was too terrified to call for help. Historians have wondered whether Ildiko did in fact murder Attila. Both Attila's aides did not think so. A speech given at Attila's funeral promised no punishment or vengeance. He fell neither by an enemy's blow nor by treachery, the speaker said, but safe among his own people, happy, rejoicing, without any pain. Attila's funeral followed nomadic traditions. His body lay under a silk tent on the windy plain. Hun warriors galloped around the tent singing songs of praise. Each soldier's face was stained with his own blood. The men had sliced their cheeks and cut off hunks of hair to show their grief. Attila was buried amid great secrecy. A small army of slaves dug his tomb in the dead of the night. Attila's men feared that grave robbers might try to dig up the gold and gems buried with their king. So they surprised the burial party and slaughtered the slaves. The location of Attila's grave would remain a secret forever. With that final massacre, Attila the Hun passed into legend. Page 119. Wicked? Attila's death was surprising yet somewhat fitting. A conqueror who glutted himself with the blood of others died choking on his own. Fortune tellers once claimed that the Huns would decline after Attila, only to be revived by his youngest son. History proved them right on the first prediction and wrong on the second. After Attila's death, his sons squabbled over control of the empire. The civil war crippled the Huns, who were then defeated by the East Roman Empire and rival barbarian tribes. The East Romans stuck the head of one of Attila's sons on a pole and carried it proudly through the streets of Constantinople. By 469, the Huns had been chased to southern Russia, where they merged with other tribes. The Hun threat to Europe had died with Attila. The West Roman Emperor faded almost as quickly. With Attila dead, Valentinian saw no reason to keep Aetius around. In 454, the emperor personally stabbed Aetius to death. Aetius's bodyguards got revenge, stabbing Valentinian to death the following year. 9 emperors ruled over the next 21 years. Of them, 2 were deposed and 6 died violently. The last emperor, Augustulus, was overthrown by a barbarian in 476. The West Roman Empire had been swept away. Corruption and intrigue also plagued the East Romans. Yet their empire lasted another 1,000 years, becoming known as the Byzantine Empire. As Attila had learned, Constantinople was nearly impossible to attack. No army was able to breach the city's walls until after the invention of cannons. Nearly 1,500 years after Attila's death, the question remains, was he truly as wicked as his reputation? It's hard to tell from ancient accounts of the Hun king's life. Most of them were written by Attila's enemies, either Romans or Visigoths. They naturally paint him in a negative light. Modern Hungarians, on the other hand, consider Attila a national hero. Some Hungarians even name their sons after him. Overall, though, Attila's legacy remains a dark one. His most important achievement was to help topple the West Roman Empire. Weak as it was, the empire had spread culture and order throughout Europe. When it disappeared, schools closed, roads fell into disrepair, trade declined, and scientific study stalled. Life in Europe became more primitive for the next 5 centuries. Attila did not usher in this dark age alone. He got the blame because he was a pagan leader in an increasingly Christian world. Many paintings done after Attila's death showed the Hun leader with the horns and pointed ears of a devil. While Attila's crimes have been exaggerated, the terror he inspired has not. Attila ground almost the whole of Europe into dust, one contemporary wrote. Today, most people know little about Attila's deeds, yet his name remains a household word that signifies ruthlessness and destruction. Attila is a bogeyman that people can't seem to forget.